Welcome to the In Between podcast,
a space for real conversations and meaningful interviews about life, faith, culture, leadership,
and everything in between.
Hey, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about finances and fairy tales.
And everything in between.
Because our world right now feels like the financial world is collapsing all around us. Banks are failing. It's just this big debt ceiling conversations.
There's some things.
Yeah, and you know, in our own personal financial lives, you know, we're constantly wondering, like, where can I get good advice?
How do I make good decisions?
And so today, that's what we're going to talk about.
Maybe not on TikTok.
Not on.
Or maybe some of it could be on TikTok. I'm just saying it might.
That's part of the problem, right? You just don't know.
True.
Like, what's good advice, what's not good advice, and that's what we're doing.
It is. And so we have a really wonderful guest today, John Kim. He's an entrepreneur, investor, church planter, and pastor. All those things living in one person and so much more. He's the founder of Boardroom Adventures, which is a Web3 blockchain agency and venture fund. He founded the Karamaan Group, which is a long-term investing firm that takes ownership in public and private companies. He's been a partner in the past at MSD Capital, which is the family office overseeing the assets of Michael Dell. Most recently, this is very cool. A new add to his CV, as it were, is that he's an adjunct professor. He's teaching college algebra and pre-calculus to incarcerated people at a maximum security facility in the New York area. So John's a Harvard guy, an MIT guy. He did his doctorate in game theory and finance. He's also a member of the board of trustees of Vineyard USA and is a board member of Vineyard in Manhattan in New York City. He and his wife, Kara, and their son, Samuel, reside in Midtown, New York. And he says he's a long-suffering New York Knicks fan.
That is long-suffering.
And he loves food. He loves food, too.
And he and Rich will be.
Exactly. It's a really interesting conversation about, you know, how is it that somebody who is an expert in this space combines not only a knowledge of finance and investing, but also interest in things like contemplative spirituality to approach financial conversations in maybe a different way than you've heard before. So enjoy the conversation. Well, John, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. Super glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with a question a little bit about you. You're a Harvard guy and MIT guy. You have a PhD focused in game theory and finance, which I think is so cool. And one of the newest things on your CV is that you're an adjunct professor, Mount St. Mary's College, and it sounds like what you're doing is teaching sort of college level maths at a correctional facility. And so I'm just curious to hear a little bit about that. How did you end up in that space? How is it going?
Yeah, I think prison ministry is pretty near and dear to my heart.
Cool.
It all started maybe several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. Somebody just asked, hey, do you want to teach at Rikers Island Correctional Facility? And, it was through Prison Fellowship, which is one of the largest outreaches to the incarcerated and their families. And so I was going to teach the Alpha course, which I know is a favorite at Vineyard Columbus and candidly the whole church. And so, I taught the Alpha course, the whole 12 weeks without the Holy Spirit day away, obviously, because they were on the inside.
Yeah.
And that really started my journey of really loving on prisoners. And I think maybe in a sense, I had a profound sympathy, a profound almost identification with just the way that who they are and how maybe their lives went sideways. I saw the same possibilities in myself, but for the grace of God. And it was an incredibly rewarding experience. And then literally just a couple of weeks ago, somebody asked me, hey, they're looking for a math teacher to teach sort of college level algebra and pre-calculus at a maximum security correctional facility.
Wow.
I hadn't applied for a job in about 25 years. And I had, candidly, I left academia in 1998.
Okay.
And so I had to do my best to position myself as I'm actually a learner and teacher at heart, even though I've been an investor entrepreneur and I'm not some cold-blooded capitalist. I'm actually, I really love teaching and learning.
Wow.
And so, I was approved just actually about a week ago, and we'll be starting this in May, teaching at Karamaan, which is, again, a maximum security correctional facility. It's just about 2 hours north of New York City.
Okay.
So,
incredible.
That's amazing. And algebra and pre-calculus, you said.
yes.
So I feel like you're going to be a great, I had to teach my kids that during COVID. I have a background in English and creative writing. So as you can imagine, it was probably a little less robust than your students' experience is going to be.
I was just going to say, I actually love kind of bringing mathematics alive is actually a passion of mine. I know that at least when I was growing up, it was taught in a very dry way. It's like the derivative of x squared is 2x. And, but what does that even mean?
Exactly.
And so I've always tried to teach math more as exploration, as a search for order, a search for truth, or even beauty.
Wow.
I know that's a stretch for some, but so I'm really looking forward to it.
That's wonderful. John, so we want to talk with you about finances and fairy tales. And there's a lot happening in the world today that we're going to get into. But I think it would be really helpful. People are searching for gurus, right? Like, show me how to make my million. And there's millions of books on how to make your million and podcasts and all the rest. But I'd love to center this conversation in your story. And just your own story with finances and money. And, it would be, I think, helpful for listeners to hear your journey, even where you come from, because you're a child of immigrants to this country, and you didn't come from great financial means. And so just love to hear a little bit of your story.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, my parents, they came to this country in the early 70s. They're part of what I think is a pretty large wave of immigrants from East Asia, specifically from Korea. And it was in many ways a reset for them in their lives. They wanted to give their children, me and my sisters, opportunity. They viewed America as a place for that. At the same time, I distinctly remember, and my sisters and I both heard a lot of the following of kind of, hey, we're in America, we're actually not natives here, and so we have to probably work twice as hard, 3 times as hard for maybe to get the same results as others. So we were aware of the reality of our situation, and yet at the same time, my parents were very progressive in the sense that they didn't raise us within kind of an Asian enclave. There are many in New York. I was born and raised in New York. They were always pushing us into maybe what I would call maybe center society. So doing the things that other American kids were doing. So I played sports the way a lot of American kids played sports. I watched all the TV shows, and they actually spoke English to me as well.
Oh, wow.
So my parents, even though their English is not their primary language, they probably speak better English than the vast majority of folks their age. And I actually did not even learn Korean until I got to college.
Wow.
So I was very much Americanized, while at the same time, and especially as I got to college and as I came of age, I think I became more aware of the fact that, the immigrant experience is different in some ways. But certainly having gone to school, spent both my undergraduate and graduate years at Cambridge at Harvard and MIT, that gave, candidly, access to a lot of worlds that I don't think I would have otherwise had access to. And so there was always this sort of dualistic nature to sort of my formative years of understanding that in some sense I've been othered, but in other ways I've actually been the beneficiary of a lot of the systems, that are set up in this country. So,
wow.
And along with that, I wonder how your experience of the kingdom and what you know of the kingdom has impacted how you view money over the years through your early formation and then through those early experiences at Cambridge and at other places as you were beginning to, be introduced to this world.
Yeah.
How is it that you thought or did you have any mentors that helped you think in a Christian way about this world?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. One of the things that I don't think I talk about it very much, but my parents actually went through some very significant financial difficulties that were kept hidden from me and my sisters for a very, very long time. And I became aware of it towards the end of my late college, early grad school. It was almost as if it was like a dark secret that was kept from the kids. And so I think when it dawned on me what had happened, and it's not an unusual story. I think they were, in some sense, over-levered. They borrowed against their assets and they were unable to make it work. A little bit like what happened to Silicon Valley Bank
I was going to say,
weekend.
We'll get there,
We'll get to that. But when I became aware of that, and I was not yet a follower of Jesus, I think a switch went off within me. And I felt a deep desire to almost maybe even rescue my family from what had transpired. And that's part of the reason why I think I was so motivated. I ended up finishing my PhD in 2.5 years, which is pretty fast in general. Yep. And I was pretty convicted that I needed to go and become gainfully employed. And so this is all happening around the time I'm becoming aware of life with God.
Okay.
And so respect for my parents. I have a deep love and respect, affection, admiration for my parents. And then coming into life in the kingdom, and I came to faith through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Yep. And I think very quickly became aware of the way the Bible talks about money. And I think initially I was grooved into kind of what it means to be generous. So I kind of had the basics around tithing and, gosh, what is this thing that Christians do where they give 10%?
Why are you giving away your money?
Their pre-tax income to this entity. But I became convicted. And, you were asking, was there anyone involved in those early stages? I think in many ways, the waters in which I was swimming in, there was sort of a normalization around generosity, at least in the InterVarsity world that I was a part of. Maybe even to some extent, there was a negative view of money that, money's the root of all evil, or desire of money. Even though I think it's a desire of money is the root of all evil, but it could easily be translated to anybody who has money. Yeah. And so I think financial success came relatively early in my career. Took just a couple years for me to make partner at, one of the largest, principal investment firms. And I think my wife and I both felt like, well, we need to be very, very, we need to give this away as fast as we can because it's not good to hold on to a lot of it. And then I distinctly remember at one point in my quiet time with the Lord, I actually felt his rebuke around as if we were not being as good stewards in how we were sort of donating as we were as investors. And that's when I think I developed a more expansive view about what it means to be a steward. I mean, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Right. And anybody who doesn't believe that maybe hasn't thought it through. And so the idea that actually nothing actually belongs to us, but capital actually has a purpose. It's actually talked about a lot in the biblical narrative.
Yep.
And as we groove ourselves and align ourselves with that, there's actually there's a deeper joy, a deeper satisfaction that emerges. And in many ways, that's what I've been working out for the last 25 yeas. So
that's amazing. And we want to get there, but maybe I can back us up to that phrase that you used to describe as they couldn't make it work. Because I think in order to get to places where we talk about stewardship and kingdom building, these like big picture ways of understanding finances, there's like there's a long runway for a lot of folks, right? And so it has to do with things like discernment and education and wisdom. And right now we're experiencing in the world around us, I mean, you reference what's happening SVB and this sort of situation with certain large banks failing that's happening around us. We've got conversations in the government about debt ceiling. People have personal questions that, which is why we want to talk about finances and fairy tales, because there are so many gurus on the internet, and it's, the crypto phase. And if you just throw a little bit of money into this pot and stir it the right way, by Friday, you will indeed end up with $1 gazillion. That sort of, and there's a lot of different iterations of that. So maybe we could back it up and you could help us think a little bit about just some of the things that we're seeing around us. So when it comes to what's happening, people are reading in the news about SVP, certain banking, I don't know if one would call them convulsions or slow motion tankings or whatever. As you're watching what's happening, how is it that you sort of perceive that, understand that? Could you help make sense of that a little bit to folks who are listening?
Sure. When I think of the way our world understands money,
right?
I think you alluded to this earlier. I want to highlight actually an example that I think might actually be helpful for our listeners. There was a mutual fund that was the best performing mutual fund over a 10-year period. And if you put your money in that mutual fund, if you put $100 in that mutual fund at the beginning of that 10-year period, and then just close your eyes, went to sleep for 10 years, if you Rip Van Winkle those 10 years, you would have woken up after 10 years with $100 having turned into $550, which is an extraordinary return by any measure. That's 18.5% per year. Anybody would have taken that and then some. However, nobody who owned this mutual fund over that 10-year period did that. What they did is they have the ability in the modern financial markets to buy and sell on a daily basis. So the actual average investor realized not an 18% return, but a negative 11% return over those 10 years. So what's the takeaway from this? If you are patient and long-term oriented, you will actually, and you have some beliefs and convictions that you're willing to be faithful to. That's a much better chance of compounding your wealth than acting on the latest tip. Which is what most people did. So most people with this mutual fund, they didn't just buy it and then hold it through the ups and downs. What they did is they always jumped in after they heard that somebody made a lot of money on this fund. And then, of course, nothing goes straight up. Most things are volatile. The world is volatile. And so as a result, most people ended up losing money. And I think what is true here is you have, on the one hand, you would have done well if you were, again, long-term, patient, and actually had a conviction about something. And the other approach is to basically listen to the latest guru or the latest friend at a cocktail party that tells you about this new hot thing. And you could substitute mutual fund, cryptocurrency, stock XYZ, whatever, what have you. But that's not real. I mean, it's a little bit what is peddled on CNBC and what is peddled on a lot of these sort of both mainstream and social media. It's actually not that's entertainment. That's actually not really investing wisdom. And you see it all over the place.
Yeah.
Most people who trade stocks lose money. They don't tell you that at cocktail parties, but that's the underlying reality. And so I'm always trying to tell folks, just as a framework, if you're patient and long-term, and you actually act out of the things that you know and believe, you're way better off than listening to somebody who either, again, a friend or a media personality, nothing against the media personalities per se, but I think it's actually a disservice in terms of how you actually compound wealth. So
Well,
I just wanted to start with that example.
It's super helpful. And you also use the phrase that it's entertainment. And I think so even the interface for so many of these things, whether it's app-based trading, where your average 22-year-old, it feels like you're playing a game that's populated by trolls and that you're selling fake gold coins. But really, it's your actual money. And the sort of not just the entertainment, but the gamification of everything, it seems to do two things. One is it makes people feel like they're having fun, even while they're seeing a negative reality in front of them. But it also really removes people from having to think hard. So I wonder, as you think, you've done a lot of work, with game theory, risk management, and how to make risk. How is it that you discern when somebody comes to you at a cocktail party with an idea, using that Christian language of discernment? We're not all experts, but what are some of the key things that you look for or that would be red flags for you when it's like, this strategy is probably not attached to wisdom or reality or anything good for you? How do you discern things like that?
Sure. Yeah, I think what I do, and I think what I would recommend everyone do some form of, there are two things there are many things you can't outsource, but I always say you can't outsource your health and your wealth. And what I mean by that is when it comes to your health, there are no shortage of people telling you what it takes to be healthy. But I think everybody has to take accountability for their own journey of health. Two very competent, caring doctors can tell you two different things about what it takes to restore or to, stay healthy. And that's the same thing when it comes to your wealth. I think we all have to decide, what is the basic approach that I'm going to take? Because, and especially as you grow your wealth, there's no shortage of people who will pitch you things.
Yeah.
They will say, hey, do you want to get in on this? There's a new restaurant opening downtown, or there's a new cryptocurrency. There's, whatever the idea is. If you have a framework and a filter, if you have a way to think about what it means to be a good steward over money, the vast majority of things that come your way, you will actually just discard because they actually don't fit within the framework that I've developed for myself. Now, that framework should hopefully grow and evolve and change over time. But at any given moment, it's important to have something to make sense of all the possible opportunities that are out there, to make sense, to distinguish between the signal and the noise, so to speak. And so everyone will have a different one, but you need something. And you need something that is, I guess, true to both who you are, what you believe, and like how you make sense of the world. So
there's, the world we're living in now, it seems like one of the changes that's happening is, you mentioned the noise, that's out there. And obviously the noise everywhere is just multiplied in all kinds of spaces. And it feels like, I think to a lot of folks, you'd mentioned mutual funds earlier, like there was a traditional way of thinking about investment over the long term that was basically sort of like the gold standard, just slow grow, put it away, and watch it grow over the course of your lifetime. And it seems like there's been a lot of questions for a lot of folks around the underpinnings of our whole system. And at the same time, all of this noise, that's pulling people's attention to all of these alternatives because people are questioning whether this system is safe, whether it's going to do the thing that, it's done for so long. And I wonder, how is it that you discern both of those things, both the noise that, is drawing attention to, all of these new or alternative ways of investing, but also like just the basic approach to what was normal, what was the normal sort of way of investing. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about discerning about those things.
Yeah, I mean, well, one, you're totally right. There was a conventional wisdom, for lack of a better term, around investing in stocks for the long run, and you'll get a certain return. It's kind of strange that was true for a while, but every mutual fund prospectus tells you that the past is not necessarily indicative of the future. And so that's obviously been the case. And so, yeah, I try to, again, really abstract from shorthand rules. And I'm very deliberate about, when I invest, I'm always asking myself, what is, like, usually I'm investing in a business. I'm not investing in a stock. Like, a stock is, it's weird. It's like there's like this. It's a digital representation on a screen, and you can be very much alienated, almost abstracted from it when you're just trading it on your Robinhood or your Schwab account. I'm actually always asking myself, I'm actually buying a business, or I'm investing in something that actually has. It's sort of like this organism, and I mean, not to overly shill for sort of a biblical worldview, but I think the Bible talks extensively about, uses a lot of botanical analogies, I guess. When you hear, I think the parable of the talents or the minas as told in the book of Luke is a very helpful framework. It's when we think about what we're investing, we have to ask ourselves, like, what is the thing that we're actually buying? When you invest in a stock, you actually own a share of a business, and that business is generating cash flows and dividends that get paid out. And so the price that you pay today is basically dependent on their ability to do these things. And now, of course, there's always risk that the system, breaks down in some ways, but I always try to bring everything back to a very simple framework, which is, when I'm buying something, I'm buying actually a business or some sort of system that generates cash flows. And I have to evaluate to what extent do I believe in the durability, the potential for growth. So I'm trying to less, sort of listen to the latest hot tip or, some sort of pizzazz that someone can put around an idea, and just break it down into its most fundamental roots. So, yeah.
It's really helpful. So because I think most sort of ordinary people who are not financial investors and they're not, investigating particular stocks or buying particular stocks. Lots of folks are just, putting away a little bit at a time from their paycheck. They're trusting, a mutual fund, financial manager to manage all of those things. And for most folks, it's just pretty abstract, like you said.
Yeah.
But the thing that really strikes me about what you're saying is that, there's a whole system there that is behind that has generated it produces income. There's a whole history of the way it works that produces income in business. But when I think about another, area, the newer area of investment, crypto, which is like totally different, which is like, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know how it makes money. I don't know where it comes from, you know, other than, you know, there's a limited supply and that the demand for it sort of makes the price go up and down. You know, but it's not like generating all of this income. But all that to say, it is a really helpful, simple framework that you're describing, which is to investigate what is the thing behind the thing.
Yeah, and just a quick note on crypto. Like, I know it's all the rage. It's been very volatile. People probably know about FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF. There was 2022 was sort of this crazy year. Maybe even some listeners know what an NFT or Bitcoin and Ethereum is. I would say crypto was born out of the 2008 financial crisis. The initial paper that birthed Bitcoin was released right around the time the banks were being bailed out. There was a social uprising that really animated Bitcoin. It's really the first example of a cryptocurrency. And it was, in some sense, it is an alternative system to the traditional financial system. In crypto speak, they even call it's called DeFi, which is decentralized finance. And they call the traditional finance world of stocks and bonds and brokers TradFi. And so the way I would describe it almost is it's almost like an alternative. It's kind of like if you were to go to another country, they would have their own currency. And crypto, the various crypto communities are basically harnessing people's attention and energy to create an alternative economy. And the currencies for that are Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana. But what's interesting is there are bridges between the crypto worlds. Obviously, Bitcoin is quoted in US dollars, Ethereum. And so what you have is, in the same way that if you want to travel, you know, to Europe, you have to exchange dollars for euros. If you want to go to the UK, you exchange dollars for pounds. And so one way to think about it is just another world. It's its own economy, in the same way that if you were to visit another country, you would want to engage with that economy and you would need your currency to play in that world, so to speak. So it is a legitimate world. It's obviously filled with many characters who are just like in the traditional finance world.
Yeah.
They may or may not have your best interests in mind. But it is a growing community, and one that is attempting to always invite more and more people into it.
And there's a lot of risk. It reminds me of, you know, I have a kid who plays video games. And in particular video games, you can buy, you know, skins, right? So you can kind of buy, it's like a proto NFT, this concept you can like, and they're not cheap, right? It's not like $7 for the way that this particular tool looks in your game. It's like $80, $150. And at one point he was scammed, right? So he buys this thing and he doesn't get it back. And so he's super frustrated. So I'm recognizing, okay, this is a total loss, but I'm going to try to teach him how to at least follow up. So we call the credit card company because, you know, you have insurance on things that you buy. And so my conversation with the representative was hysterical because I'm like, so we bought this thing. It's not real in real life, but it's real. And so he's listening to me talk, and the person on the other end has like zero idea what I'm talking about. I'm like, it's digital, it's called a digital skin. It's like it is, you know, and they're like, but is it real? And I'm like, yeah, it's real. We had to buy it. You know, he doesn't have it. That means no. Can you touch it? Well, no. And so the whole conversation was super funny, and it wasn't funny for him, but it was it was a life lesson. That's what we were attempting to do. And it seems to me that kind of life lesson is happening in warp speed with a lot more money with a lot of people who are not maybe realizing some of the things that you're saying, which is this is like some of these more speculative spaces. They are very real. There are very real communities. They're very interesting. and they're very high risk. And I think not only are they very high risk, but so for instance, when our banks fail, you have this sort of FDIC insurance for a particular amount of deposit. So there's a degree of stability kind of in the system that can exist. But in those spaces, there's not that. So when it's gone, it's gone. And I guess what I'm wondering is, for people who are in those spaces, or they are really curious about how these kinds of different currencies work, how is it that you think about risk from a disciplined point of view? And I would add from a Christian point of view. In other words, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Everything that I have is the Lord. Every risk I take is with the stuff that is the Lord's. Kind of, how do you do that step-by-step process when we do enter into places that are a little bit more risky or speculative, where we know we don't have that sort of insurance side stabilizer, and we're thinking from a Christian point of view? Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense.
Okay.
I'll start by saying the crypto world and everything is funny hearing you talk about your son's experience. I don't know how much our listeners are aware of the whole metaverse and the whole sort of digital worlds that will be. I actually think these will be very immersive worlds.
Yep.
They will be a more compelling call on attention. I mean, the fact that people look at Instagram while they're on the beach.
Yes.
It's like you have a beautiful view of a beach, but you'd rather turn your attention to Instagram. That the metaverse will be a far more compelling call on human attention.
Yeah.
So it's definitely coming. It's real. I think people of faith have to show up in these places. We can rail against it all we want, but it is where younger folk, our children, are gravitating towards those spaces. And so we need to be there. So how do we show up in these spaces? I guess I can't stress enough to be informed.
Okay.
Like you talked about, there are guardrails. Like FDIC is a perfect example. That's a big guardrail for at least for $250,000 and less.
Right.
If you have more than that, you should be taking care of your own problems. But but there's a whole institutional structure that supports something like FDIC. In some sense, the crypto world was created because they felt like the problems associated with that institutional structure, it was creating more problems than it was worth from a positive perspective. And so there's a great deal of individual agency in these spaces, which means it's important to really know what it sounds almost pedestrian, but it's really important to know, what are you getting involved in?
Yeah.
How do these worlds actually operate? They are very risky, but my framework is actually relatively simple. As I alluded to earlier, I need a mental model. I need a model in my head for how this world works.
Okay.
But I think it was a great statistician that said all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so that model it's a human generated thing. It's far from comprehensive. It's not. So there'll be an element of risk, but that risk is very much calculated. And that's where there's only so much you can do from your own effort, your own wisdom, which you should do. You should absolutely take care of all the things that are humanly possible, but then always recognize there's an element of unknown. And I think that's where we have this strange practice in our movement and in other parts of the Christian tradition where we seek the guidance from the Lord. We try to hear from him as best we can. God is obviously not some giant spiritual vending machine. But I do think I have maybe one of the edges that I've often explored is, what does it mean to hear from God as it relates to these types of open questions around what is it? What should I do? I've done everything I can. I've answered all the questions I can answer from a structural human perspective, but I'm left with three possible options that all seem equal.
Right.
And that's where seeking the face of God and, a lot of these techniques around, how do we uncover God's will? How do we discern? What does Ignatian discernment look like? That's a sandbox that I have dipped my toe into. I'm continuing to dip my toe into, and I'm with others who are also trying to dip their toes in this way.
That makes me think a little bit. I mean, it's not often I have a conversation that includes crypto finances and Ignatian spirituality, first of all. So thank you. It's like amazing. But I'm thinking about the practice of examine. So we talk a lot about a daily examine or a weekly examine. I had a pod recently with somebody who's in the field of AI, and we talked about a digital or a technical examine. And what you're saying is making me think of almost a financial examine, and in the sense that as a person of faith, one would have a regular time set aside to review, how is it that I've been in this space? Where am I? I mean, we're attached to our money, right? We're attached to our stuff. That's very human. Where is it that those attachments have become disordered? Where are they ordered? Yeah. And what are practices moving forward that I might participate in to move me towards a more virtuous attachment to my stuff? Which is different than like writing a budget, right? It really is that sort of heart relationship. So maybe we could start talking a little bit about that, because I think that's a stewardship question, which really is our heart. How do we get our hearts to attach in the right spaces? And I wonder for you, what counsel would you have? Let me try to make this specific. So you've got, imagine you're in a room full of young entrepreneurs. They're doing well. They're starting to see wealth grow. They are maybe where you were a bunch of years ago, and they, I would imagine that place can have a lot of inclinations, right?
Yes.
And so what are some of the things that you might encourage people? What are some of the practices, I guess, is what I'm asking, to help people maintain ordered relationships with their stuff, their money, their investments?
Yeah, it's an excellent thread there. I could go on for a while, but I'll be brief here. I think there's something I've gone deeper and deeper into the monastic tradition, and one of the things there's in the Order of the Common Life. I'm a member of the Order of the Common Life. There's a real high premium on silence, solitude, and the contemplative life, and so I think there's really no substitute for, especially when it comes to things of money, which is to bring these things before the Lord in silence, and it's one of the hardest things, I think, is to be honest about how we're relating to these to things like money, wealth, and power, and everything that's associated with it. And I think, because the noise is so loud, and because especially for folks who are in entrepreneurial or business settings, your natural instinct is to do and to act. And so to withdraw, I often remind entrepreneurs that Jesus was busier than all of us, and yet he often withdrew to lonely places to pray. There's something about silence and solitude that allows God to speak and to reveal what is actually going on within us. So I'm a big proponent of silence, solitude, and the contemplative life, but then I'm also a big proponent of walking with others. So being deliberate about who you're walking with in this regard is, in many ways, money is I call it like a shared reality. So if you're around people who never feel like they have enough, pretty soon you will also feel that way.
That's really good.
That's almost like a collective problem in our country. What's the old adage? We buy things we don't want with money we don't have to impress people we don't like.
Yes.
It's like this horrible sort of place that we find ourselves in. But if you walk with people who are practicing contentment, who believe in things like simplicity, it's amazing how the nature of reality changes. And the truth of the matter is, I mean, there's all sorts of sociological research which tells you that beyond a certain amount, money doesn't really add that much to happiness. And again, anyone who's serious and thought it through would actually agree with that statement. But when you walk with others who are trying to situate and organize their lives in such a way that maybe reduces the anxiety that money creates because they're trying to fill up their lives with other things. I think it's very hard to do alone.
Yeah.
And so I think an engagement in silent solitude in the contemplative life with others is probably the best sort of quickly articulated sort of thread that I could give on that.
You talk about, just the pressures, which are all around us that, that press us into these mindsets, and the basic mindset in America, which is pretty unbelievable when you think about how much wealth, we have in America, that the good life is just out of reach. If I just had a little bit more, just a little bit, not too much, just a little bit more, then I would be happy. And you talk about, the need for community and to be in communities. One of the communities that we have, in our world here at Vineyard is a Kingdom Builders community, which has been wonderful because it's all about, folks who are already committed to certain practices like tithing. There's certain practices and habits and communities that help shape us. And these folks come together to remind each other that, yes, we do have enough. And actually that what God has given us is designed to enable us to bless others, which is really remarkable. But it's also something, to your point, that it really does take community to very intentionally address these particular mindsets that are within us, but they're also outside of us, pressing us externally. And I wonder, how is it that you have sort of found some of those places, like found community, or you talked a little bit about some of the practices that was really helpful, but just, like what intentional practices have helped you be in those spaces to kind of remind yourself of, your reality and to kind of build some of those practices that have helped guide you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it does start. I mean, you mentioned, I don't know what the stats are. I haven't looked at this in a long time, but it's hard to tithe. I get it.
Yeah.
So we start with tithing, and I know it's a loaded topic, and anytime pastors talk about tithing, it looks like it's a self-serving thing, but there has to be a space to talk about that. Yeah. So we start with that. And then then for some folks, I think the question of what is a deeper commitment to generosity, what does that look like? I think, just to be totally candid, I think, my wife and I were actively trying to discern what does it mean for us to essentially, not necessarily take a vow of poverty per se, but what does it mean to actualize this idea that it all belongs to the Lord? Because, I mean, even a person of means could easily, a lot of folks, they start foundations, right? The Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, they start these foundations. And what's interesting is foundations, especially private foundations, and we've created one, you'll seed the ability to use those funds for your own personal desires, vacations and nice cars and private jets, whatever people spend their money on. But you don't seed control. And that's an interesting thing because sometimes some folks, I would argue, are more, the issue is more control than consumption. And so I think there's some practices around generosity that is not just give to a 501c3, but to seek control, to deputize others. I think recently there's been a group of folks. Obviously, in our country, we've had this ongoing reckoning with our country's original sin, racial injustices over the last several years very intensely. And I think many of us have wondered, what does like creative sacrifice and restoration for marginalized communities, like what does that look like?
Yeah.
And these are hard things. I mean, I don't want to minimize the act of writing a check to a cause, but I'm also interested in what does it mean to not just give financially, but to offer our knowledge, our relational networks, our ourselves. I mean, that's part of the reason I'm so drawn to the prisons, even though I'm not offering money per se, but in some sense I'm giving the most scarce thing that I have, which is my time and my sort of emotional energy and love. And so I think that's where communities that have these, I think the British or Scottish theologian or philosopher Oliver O'Donovan talks a lot about common objects of love. That's what makes a community. And so we've intentionally sought out folks who have shared common objects of love, and we can sow into things very deliberately for the long haul as well. There's a kind of a long obedience in the same direction that I think can only come about when you do this with others as well.
And the one of the things that you're saying is, you know, I'm very curious about the difference between Christian formation in this area, for instance, and, you know, ideas like effective altruism, which is a big SBF thing, like a lot of crypto guys, I'm going to get rich so I can be good, or so that I can do good things. But I think what I hear you saying is that doing good is a good. I would say that we could make that ethical statement or moral statement, but that there is something, the formation that you're talking about is the formation of a person into Christ likeness. So not just how do I do good or be altruistic because I see that as a value or a virtue or makes me feel better about myself. But how is it that I actually form myself into the likeness of someone who was identified with the vulnerable, the marginalized, versus who identified himself as somebody who just had so much, I could give you a little extra and still be great at my own heart and have my own control and all of those things. So it's, I guess, the formation piece is really different for Christians in this space. It's Christian soul formation, not just doing good stuff. And that's where I think your what you said about it's not always consumption, but it's control seems really helpful for me.
Yeah. No, I like the way you put that because, you know, I think, sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second. You're talking about, just the way when we think about, there are ways to, what I actually am always encouraging people is our generosity and our willingness and desire to do good in the world is always downstream from something else. It's always downstream from the work that God is doing within us.
Love that.
Our intimacy with Jesus is always the primary thing from which, because otherwise, and this is very true, then if your generosity comes from other places, you will become embittered. You will become, you'll just be angry at some point. But if it's born out of a deeper place, it actually flows a lot more naturally. And I think that's ultimately what Jesus is most interested in as well. And, you know, so that's why these practices, like I always tell a young person who's, starting to do well in finance or something. It's like, look, just tithe. And I know it's like that's behavioral modification. That doesn't actually, but these things work iteratively, right? Like, you start with a practice, but then over time, what that leads to is a conversation of like, why and what is happening? Are you begrudgingly doing it? And are you, well, then that's a separate thing. But ultimately, these two work together. But certainly the foundation is, what is God doing? How is God making and remaking me into the image of Jesus? And for sure, in this moment, in this time, generosity in all the resources at our disposal is a surefire way that we can signal that the kingdom of God is at hand. So
that's really cool. Maybe I could, or do you have another question? Because I've got sort of a wrap-up question.
Oh, yeah. Go.
So can I ask you one wrap-up question? And
sure.
It may or may not be selfish, because I may or may not have kids who need to hear these kinds of things. So may or may not. But if I'm sure you find yourselves in lots of situations where you're talking to people who maybe are in their early 20s. Do you have like a do this, don't do that? Like, just, this isn't even 101. This is like sub 101 when it comes to their financials, how they're interacting with their money. Maybe they're making $12 an hour. Maybe they're making a lot more, but they're at the very beginning of this stage. Do you have a do this, don't do that word of advice?
Sure. I'm actually thinking about this. I think my kids are younger than yours, but starting to think about what does it mean to be financially responsible. I think taking on debt, I think I was shocked at the amount. I'm always shocked when I see how much what I call unhealthy debt there is. I might even, if possible, and I guess I understand this might not be possible for everyone, but if possible, I would strongly recommend folks starting out in life to not take on any debt if they can. Debt, it can really, there's almost a spiritual dynamic there. I think that it chokes. It's almost like a gateway to other types of downstream problems. So in conjunction with not taking on debt is the ability to, or the practice of creating margin, like consumption margin in your life. What does that mean? What does that look like? And so even if your friend is getting the latest iPhone, I mean, the iPhone from 3 years ago is pretty darn good. Is it? So just a general practice of living well within your means.
Yeah.
Very good.
Which is, I think, in conjunction with not taking on debt, if at all avoidable. Now, I know student debt and mortgage debt is a little bit different. But if at all possible to not have debt, it frees you. It is true. Debt is a little bit like a bondage contract with the lender. If you don't pay, there are consequences. And I think there are spiritual dynamics that actually flow out of that. So I would strongly encourage people, radically live within your means, and the companion to that would be, if at all possible, don't take on debt.
Okay.
That's great advice.
That's really good advice.
So helpful.
And it's difficult. I mean,
It's really hard.
I think it's really difficult, especially for a lot of young folks who feel like that's my only way to a next thing. And so I do want to acknowledge, and it can come, I mean, a lot of these conversations too, they come with a lot of weight or baggage or shame for people. So a part of what I appreciate is that you approach these conversations not just from a prerogative of do the right thing, but there's formation that can happen even when we do feel like, oh my gosh, I am overwhelmed in this situation. And so a huge part of, I think, Christian formation, it does influence our financials, because those things influence our hearts and how we're able to interact spiritually and all of that. So,
and being in spaces where, just as we were talking about the importance of community in shaping certain kinds of practices, like being in community where you can realize because certain things are impossible,
Truly.
but a lot more things feel impossible than truly are. And this whole idea of living with margins and with means, for some folks, it just feels like it's just not possible.
Right.
Like, you don't understand my situation. I'm a single parent, and I have all of these pressures, and therefore it is what it is. But, the thing that, that I know lots of folks have learned over time is that when you're in spaces with others who have done things that feel impossible, you begin to see possibilities that maybe felt like closed doors for you in the past. And so just, overcoming those places, as you said, Julie, of shame or fear, where you feel like I can't really open up this to other people, is a really big part of getting to that financial freedom that John you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All of that, and don't buy NFTs. That's kind of my, like, you do not need that. You do not need that. That's my word. That's my word of wisdom.
Man, there's so much we didn't get to. I have like 50 more questions about the bank failures and our national debt and all kinds of other things.
Like disciplined spending when everybody else. I mean, that's one of the hard things for people, right? Is that you look at the world around you, like, they don't have to be disciplined in what they're doing. Why should I?
What's up with that?
We'll save that. We'll save that for another conversation.
That'll be another conversation.
Thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys having me. And God bless you guys and everything that the Lord is doing at Vineyard Columbus. It's a huge inspiration to so many of us. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for joining us for this week's conversation. As you listen to this episode, what stood out to you the most? Let us know by emailing podcast@vineyardcolumbus.org, or if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. All the books mentioned in today's episode can be found in our online bookstore at vineyardbookstore.com. Have a great week.